So, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to this side event on the launch of the recommendations for green and healthy sustainable transport. We even have hard copies and I will show these to you later on. My name is Francesco Dionori, most of you know me already, from the Secretariat and of course Chief of Transport Networks and Logistics Section at UNECE. Of course, this event is prepared under the auspices of the PEP high-level meeting and is a very important addition to that and something that we look forward to positive outcomes on Monday and Tuesday next week. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Today, of course, we'll be launching and discussing the publication on the recommendations by reviewing the various topics raised and analyzed by the specialized task force, UN task force set up and tasked with developing the recommendations themselves. You will see from the program of the session that's now on screen that we have a number of very interesting speakers today, and I will introduce them when we get to the individual panel discussion. From a technological point of view, we will be having a question and answer session after the main interventions. Please feel free to post your questions directly in the chat rather than in the Q&A. You will find this on the right of your screen. I would like to remind the speakers, if you have sent us slides, we will be loading them and changing them directly centrally from here, our dedicated UNECE control room, we've decided to call it. So please just say next slide, please, and we will change the slides for you. Before I pass the floor to Mr. Lee for his introduction, I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Robert Thaler, Chairman of the PEP, and of course, and importantly, also Chairman of our task force that prepared these recommendations. So thank you very much, Robert, for joining us this morning, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Francesco. Thank you, Yuwei, and thanks all of you participating here in this side event in the frame of the high-level meeting. Best wishes from Vienna, from the host country. I think this initiative started after the shock of the COVID pandemic last year. Is an absolutely important one, and I'm very pleased that we achieved in a very innovative setting, I have to say. So in a combination of stakeholders from outside the governments and stakeholders from inside the governments, and a very innovative, integrative approach. And we ended up with these recommendations of green and healthy sustainable transport, which we'll adopt it as an annex to the Vienna Declaration. So I think it's a very big step forward. I think it was also very crucial for the PEP, and that's, I have to underline that the PEP member states, after this shock of this restriction and the COVID crisis last year, decided we have to elaborate guidelines, recommendations for member states, how to react on the one side, but also how to rebuild, how to restart our mobility after this shock. So, and I think this is contributed very much also to the title of the conference, as the title is now Building Forward Better. So I think this is I think the important approach, looking into the future, not say build back better. Please avoid this. We don't want to build back everything as it was before. We want to take at least the advantage of this shock to build the new future of mobility better. So with this, I hope the recommendations will help a lot the member states and also on the international level to really build better to really build forward better our mobility system in the future. So good luck for your webinar and thanks for the initiative. And of course, thanks to all the member states and experts involved, and also of course to UNECE and WHO serving as a secretariat for this really important exercise. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for those inspiring words. And of course, thank you for leading us through the work of the task force. I think your leadership was very fundamental in making sure that we could produce something so effective and also in such a limited amount of time. I would like to now move straight into the discussion with an introduction from my director, the director of the Sustainable Transport Division of UNECE, Mr. Yuwei, who will explain the background to the document. So thank you very much, Mr. Lee, for joining us today, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Francesco, and thank the government of Austria for hosting this important high-level event, and also thank Robert as the chair for the good opening. And now it's my honor to give this a brief introduction about the recommendations for green and healthy sustainable transport, building forward better. And I will provide you a little background, and the other colleagues will give you introduction to the very specific recommendations one by one. And for me, it's like, we are in the middle of a crisis. Okay, this is one crisis. We are in, and we know, and we have a lot of things to worry, and a lot of things to think, and we need to overcome the daily difficulties in our life. But at the same time, you may know that it's only one of the crises in our humans' history. And in the past, every crisis left a learning for us. And also there's finally, for us, that's we overcame the challenge of challenges, and then developed to a higher level. And then we got more knowledge and more skills and then new technologies. And then those made our life stronger and then smarter and better. So for the pipe, is systematically used this approach for the past crises, and then to see what we can learn from the current pandemic, and then how we can identify the ways to build our life better in the future. So that's the way for this approach, and then that's the way, say, the pipe can contribute to our society under this pandemic. Next, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay. And then you see, for me, basically, I follow what I said to see, the way for the pipe to make the recommendations for the future sustainable transport system. And then there's, there's to do this exercise, the pipe steering committee bureau set up a task force in April 2020. So the very timely from the beginning of the crisis. And then the objective of this task force is to make synthesis of the main lessons learned from the COVID-19 crisis, and then to propose a set of recommendations in order to support countries in making the transition to green and healthy, sustainable transport, and then to make our lives better in the future. And then there's the task force is composed of over 50 experts from the ministries, city authorities, international organizations, IGOs, NGOs, academia, and the industry. So for the task force, totally 8 monthly meetings were organized. And then from May 2020 to January 2021. Next, please. And then there's what the task force learned is that they, that they use the experience sharing. So a lot of time that's spent for the experience sharing in the task force meetings. And then they tried to learn from this is the ongoing, the past and ongoing crisis of the COVID-19. And then there's and then they collected information on the transport sector pre-2020 and also in the 2020. Made a comparison, and what they found to say there's some high impact areas of this COVID-19 on the environment and the health. And that is like, you know, the reduced pollution. And then also there's reduced road traffic fatalities. So those are because there's more virtual meetings and then more walking, cycling, and also telecommuting from home. And then you say that, yes, we are doing those without other choice. But you will see after the crisis, and more say that virtual meetings will continue, and more people will take bicycles, and then more people will work from home. So those will continue after the crisis. And the next, please. But also there are some other impacts you can see. Of course, you know, there's because of lockdown and then the restrictions. And then there's very obvious, there's a reduced use of public transport. And also there's a reduced distance traveled by cars. So in association with those, and then you see, you know, the reduction of NO2 emissions is by 65%. That's a lot cut from the past. And then there's, you see from what we learned to say what happened, and also what is the impact to the transport, and what should be left for the future, and then what should be further improved, and then to make the future transport more green. So we say that it's greener or more healthy, and then to really make the transport system in the future sustainable and resilient. So those are the ideas based on those, and then the Piper task force has made a series recommendations for the future. So I stop here, and then there's a hope that you can actively discuss those recommendations, and then that's really make the recommendations understandable for all of you, and then also used by the countries, and then to make our lives better. Thank you very much. And now I over back to Francesco, and then to continue the introduction to the specific recommendations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lee, for providing us with this very important background information. I think it really has helped to set the scene. Before I give the floor to the individual speakers, and let's call them the panelists, I guess, to cover the individual recommendations, I would like to really to mention that these recommendations were framed within the aim of responding to a call for action. This, in fact, is something that's identified within the publication itself. And really, what this call for action identifies is, as Mr. Lee has said, and as Mr. Thaler also have said, that things cannot go back to the way they were before. That really transforming transport and mobility for the better needs to have at its center also a strong public transport component and solution, and of course also a strong active mobility component. What we've seen is that as the COVID-19 has really exacerbated socioeconomic and gender inequalities. So something needs to be done in this area, and really there is a strong opportunity here, although maybe opportunity is not the right word, to build forward better, to take the necessary actions going forward. We want to, I guess, make sure that we're locking out the negative aspects of before, but also to lock in the positive developments in terms of mobility policy that have developed since then. We also need to be implementing actions that need to induce behavioral change. So by providing users with the capability and the opportunity, as well as the motivation to change their transport habits. All this, of course, in the framework of addressing the problems together and with an eye to the so-called avoid, shift, and improve principle, which is something that very much is the basis of the work that we've done in the recommendations, and also that was discussed earlier in the previous session that we had organized, previous seminar that we had organized by Dutch colleagues. So without further ado, I'd like to get into the discussion of the individual recommendations. Our first speaker, Brian Evans, I cannot see him connected at the moment. He told me he may have had some difficulties connecting right at the start. So maybe we can come back to Brian's intervention, and I hope I don't put you on the spot, Chris, and we can move first to you and to your discussion in relation to the recommendation on public transport. Chris, over to you. Thank you very much. And as mentioned before, of course, we will be changing the slides at this end, so please do just ask us the next slide, please. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. I'm sorry, I've only just arrived. I've been at another meeting in the Netherlands or in Ether somewhere. But actually, it's all been relevant because we've been talking about the development of international rail, public transport, and linking it with multimodality and so forth. But today I'm going to talk about recommendation 2, putting effective and safe public transport at the center of mobility. I'm going to talk about increasing investment in public transport to ensure that it can meet the current and future needs, making public transport the cornerstone of an accessible and attractive mobility system. It was capable of enticing people away from their private vehicles. So helping to make cities and settlements safe, inclusive, resilient and sustainable, helping to meet Sustainable Development Goal number 11 a reality. And you remember that number 11 is about universal access to safe, affordable, accessible and sustainable transport systems. I'm waiting for another slide. There we are. Just to explain my background, I'm a board member of something called the European Passengers Federation. I do my best to keep the needs of users and their aspirations, the needs and aspirations of end users, passengers, people, uppermost in our minds when we're developing our recommendations. And that was how we approached this study. Next slide, please. We were very mindful of what I would describe as a symbiotic relationship between effective, high quality and safe public transport and the promotion of more active travel. One feeds the other. We know the case based on rational argument. But of course, people won't surrender their comfort and their convenience of their cars very easily, even for short local journeys, unless they can be attracted by an alternative that appears every bit as accessible and attractive to them as the cocoon and comfort and privacy of their own car. We don't live in an age of a command economy any longer. Modal shift depends on improving the appeal of what we have to offer. The COVID-19, next slide please, the COVID-19 pandemic has created a challenging legacy for public transport. The downturn in its usage has rocked the business model on which it's based. Reduced income and suppressed economic activity, greater relative dependence on private vehicles as people try to avoid infection, keep away from each other. The effectiveness of public authorities in discouraging the use of public transport, despite the very scant evidence that it is actually a significant vector in the spread of the virus, but public authorities have been very effective in suppressing that use. In my own country, the United Kingdom, I notice that now, really psychologically well out of the pandemic, pandemic's greatest limitations, public transport usage is still only around 20% of normal. Now, I think that may be rather worse than in other countries, but I was just hearing today from the European Commission that Rail usage is by passengers about 40% of normal. So big changes. But there's also the awareness of the environmental and social hazards of private motoring. Data over the last few months has shown that many people have increased their active travel, cycling, walking. It also shows us that once the plunge has been taken to try it again, public transport users are more confident with their ability to travel safely, particularly where operators improve their service quality standards, where they've provided something better. Slide number 5, please. I've just been actually again on UK figures interested. The figure's gone from a low around 4% of traditional public transport usage to 20-odd% now. That's quite a substantial increase on what it has been at its lowest. But we're talking about winning people, and that's the key. People won't leave the comfortable cocoon of their modern private vehicle unless the public offering is seriously improved. Have you tried waiting for an overcrowded bus during peak hours on a cold, northern European, damp, smokestack city? We know what passengers' priorities are. Here are the top ones. But modal shift costs, it requires improvements to be made. People want to travel safe. They want value for their money. They want a service that's dependable, where there's sufficient capacity. They need information, not just about when the bus will travel or when the train will travel or tram will travel, but how things are going, particularly when things go wrong. And they need access for all. And perhaps more than ever, they want good connections, not just between services, but good connectivity with data, broadband, information exchange, as people's habits are changing, as their working patterns are changing. So next slide, please. Now, that list of key things is no great insight. Recommendation 1, I imagine Brian will make reference to this, referred to Sustainable Development Goal number 11. And if you look at 11.2, the target 11.2, and also to the very good THEPP handbook on sustainable urban mobility and spatial planning, you'll see there that there is a great clarity. It's a holistic, a multidisciplinary approach that's required, one in which transport, health, quality of life, environmental objectives are fully integrated into spatial planning. Next slide, please. And so, as always, one comes to money. Accessible and affordable public transport is an investment. It's at the core of mobility, a key enabler of healthy, sustainable, and active travel. When we appraise the case for that investment, we need to take a wide and inclusive view of the benefits and the costs. Our methodology must incorporate the long horizons involved without losing sight of the urgency of the challenges that we face. We must be innovative in exploring a variety of funding models, public-private partnerships, less fashionable in the UK now than they were, land value taxation, where the community recovers from a site's value something from the benefits of the public service and infrastructure it's provided. We all know cases where landowners have taken windfall benefits brought about by the opening of a new transport infrastructure, where a new metro line has suddenly transformed not just the viability of communities, the economic prosperity of communities, but transformed the bank balances of property owners and developers in that area. It's only right that the public, the community, gets something back from that. And I suspect that that may be, although a big political challenge, the most fertile source for public finance in future. And then green bonds, perhaps, and funding partnerships, perhaps, where they be mounted equitably between local interested parties and public authorities, and that's just to name but a few. So no one size will fit all, and you can't really have half measures with public transport. It's got to be good. It's got to be so good that it attracts people away from the deleterious usage of private vehicles. Sustainable mobility is literally a vital goal, vital in the true sense of the word. We need to improve it if we're going to achieve necessary modal shift. We'll only deliver if we're prepared to invest in making it effective, high quality, and safe, as safe as we can, and as safe as those things to which we aspire. So people feel good when they're traveling. They don't feel that traveling by public transport is a statement of failure, but they think it's a statement of purpose and success. So thank you very much. Those, I think, are the messages I wanted to give across. Thank you, Francesco.
Thank you very much for that, Chris, and apologies I didn't introduce you properly. Mr. Christopher Irwin of the European Passenger Federation. I apologize for that. Of course, public transport is really central to all our mobility needs going forward, especially in the post-pandemic recovery. And so we need to make sure that there is really appropriate investment. I think the discussion we were able to develop within the team that focused on this recommendation number 2, really did provide some good insights and some good governance, let's say, ideas to then propose to member states. So I think it's really a good step forward, and something that, as with all the recommendations, of course, in the document, we can all be very proud of. So thank you again, Chris, for that. I would now like to pass the floor to Mr. Lorenzo Casullo, Associate Director at Ricardo Energy and Environment. Lorenzo coordinated recommendation number 3, and he will take us through capitalizing on micro and e-mobility. So thank you very much, Lorenzo. Over to you.
Thank you, Francesco, and thank you to the UNECE and WHO and the PEP for giving us the opportunity today to report on what has been a really interesting journey, to use a transport metaphor. From the beginning of the pandemic, really the onset, to today, we have been able as a group to track developments, to exchange ideas, and to propose a way forward, which is indeed a way forward and not a way backwards. So it's really a great pleasure to be able to report very briefly, but hopefully comprehensively, on the work done around recommendation 3, capitalizing on micro and e-mobility. And these two trends, micro-mobility and e-mobility, have really been accelerated by the developments linked to the pandemic, by the policies linked to the pandemic, and by the behavioral changes linked to the pandemic. They were already existing, and they were already moving fast and changing the way we travel, the way we move, both passengers and freight. But we have seen an increased acceleration of this trend in recent months. And so our group has been concerned with capturing this trend using the best data possible, but besides describing it, also capitalizing on it, which means increasing opportunities for avoiding, shifting, improving, decarbonizing, and making transport healthier and more sustainable. So on the next slide, I will just briefly take you through the trends that we have seen. We see a really strong increase in the adoption of electric vehicles, including electric cars, across the region. There are sales going from 2% of total car sales up to 50% of total car sales in different countries of the UNECE region. We see the electrification of private transport, but also the electrification of public transport, shifting away from, for example, diesel-powered buses towards trams and electric buses. And at the same time, we see that the rise of micromobility converges with the rise of e-mobility. Pedal-assisted e-bikes have boomed in recent years, and walking, e-micromobility, for example, by e-scooters and cycling, including through e-bikes, have increased dramatically during the pandemic as a result of people looking for individual transport options to be able to travel safely. And finally, we have identified the trend of growing cargo deliveries linked to the rise of e-commerce and online shopping. And this has been in turn accompanied by a growth of delivery e-vehicles, which we see in the streets of many of our cities in the region these days. So all of these trends have come through a combination of systemic, behavioral, and policy change. And the policy change, thanks to the inputs of the member countries taking part in the task force, have been captured under this recommendation. Some examples: we have seen increased investment in cycling infrastructure across France, new subsidies for the purchase of electric vehicles in Greece, and vouchers for the purchase of two-wheelers, including electric two-wheelers, bikes, and scooters across Italian cities. All of these policies, combined with the underlying trends, have had strong impacts onto the transport systems of our cities and regions. The task force, I should say, has been really benefiting from the inputs of different stakeholders, as Mr. Thaler was saying, both from the public and the private sector, associations like CONEBI and institutions like the European Environment Agency. And all together, we have identified 4 key impacts and challenges linked to the rise of e- and micromobility. The first one is changes in accessibility. Active modes and micromobility can really enhance last-mile connectivity. And on top of that, shared mobility is now a feature of our mobility system, complementing mass transit. At the same time, if mass transit is electrified, we see that it can increase the comfort of users and passengers. Besides accessibility, we see strong impacts on environmental and health dimensions. Electrification obviously links to a decrease in emissions, including CO2 emissions, as we shift away from. And last mile e-mobility activity can also be a source of physical activity. The challenge here is whether, on the whole, the introduction of electric vehicles is positive in terms of environmental change when you consider the whole life cycle of electric vehicles. And that we raised as a challenge for policymakers. The third aspect is in relation to inclusive and affordable transport. We see the potential, and this is what capitalizing on e-micromobility means, capturing the potential for shared and electric vehicles to be a cost-effective alternative to both private cars and to building expensive public transport systems in more remote areas. The combination, the symbiotic relationship of active travel and public transport is something that we can capitalize on at this point in time. And finally, on safety, obviously there are concerns linked to the rise of micromobility, especially in cities, and we see the need to have adequate regulations and protected infrastructure to manage safety risks, while also making sure that the interface between public transport and active mobility modes, especially when electrified, is not left unregulated, but actually it is promoted through good planning and participation of different public and private actors. This was a brief overview of the topics discussed and captured under theme 3. In the next slide, I will briefly take you through the recommendations that the group has come up with. And the recommendations really aim to accompany the rise in e-micromobility, to capitalize on it, and to make it a force to reduce emissions, to have sustainable transport and improve safety across the transport system. So what did our group recommend? Well, first, to carry out comprehensive assessments of e-mobility solutions. We see that the rise of e-mobility can be sometimes scattered and chaotic. And so these comprehensive assessments really need to take stock and understand whether there is an overall reduction in pollutant emissions on a life cycle perspective, whether the health benefits, including safety benefits, are substantial, and whether congestion on our road networks and our streetscape can be minimized effectively. Then what did we say? We said if these assessments are positive, we see the value of e-mobility incentives for both citizens and companies to promote this trend, the acceleration of this trend, to ride this wave, and to really take the opportunity linked to the pandemic to electrify transport systems, to promote active mobility for last mile, both for passengers and cargo. Combination of incentives and infrastructure, however, is critical. They don't work in isolation, and one doesn't work without the other. So infrastructure investment in supporting facilities will also continue to be needed. Specifically, the theme 3 recommendations focused on charging points and stations to make sure that range anxiety, as it is described for electric vehicles, does not kick in. We also recommend the development of protected road lanes, especially for bikes, to enhance user safety. And as I mentioned earlier, we recommend that infrastructure investment targets intermodal infrastructure with public transport systems, including digital infrastructure, to provide information about accessibility and prices and availability of travel options to all citizens. How can we do that? Partially through public resources, which are continuing to come forward in many countries of the region in response to the economic downturn. So to direct those resources to e-micromobility to make it a success, but also leveraging private capital wherever it is available in the form of, for example, green finance. These were the key recommendations from our group. I would like to conclude with a small example from Ricardo's experience. Ricardo Energy and Environment is the consultancy I work for in the sustainable transport team. And we are devising new solutions for local authorities and cities to really push the electrification of transport systems in a sustainable and safe and planned way. So an example of our work is the bus charm tool, which is a modeling tool that allows local authorities to effectively optimize the location of bus charging infrastructure. Bus charging infrastructure, when you switch to electric buses, can be a challenge. So we are seeing from our experience that there is a need to plan this investment in order to make it cost-effective and technologically advanced. We can answer questions such as which solutions are technically feasible and cost-effective. How do you procure the buses, the electric buses, once you have looked at the geography and the costs of an electric public charging network? Should you invest more in bus depots, or should you invest more in dynamic chargers, or should you have batteries with longer range but that are heavier, or shorter range but lighter? And finally, we help authorities, as I said in our first recommendation from the group, to really assess the environmental and economic impacts of switching to e-mobility. This is just one example of the work that our partners are doing as part of this group that worked on the recommendation. I invite you to read it and to find further references to the work done by the EEA, CONEBI, the Ministry of Sustainable Development in France, and all of the partners who participated to this effort. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to present these recommendations, and I look forward to your questions later.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo, for that excellent introduction and overview of the discussions in Recommendation 3. Of course, micro and e-mobility need to also be a key component of our new mobility environment, and really you've highlighted that. And they need to be really a key aspect, let's say, of us ensuring this better recovery. So thank you very much for taking us through on that. If I may, I'd like to move on to Recommendation 4. And as you can see on screen, I had the pleasure of coordinating this recommendation directly. And if I may, I'd like to take you through really introducing effective mobility management. Sorry, that was the title of our recommendation. So next slide, please. Thank you. Fundamental, of course, to the discussions, to our discussions, are efforts to incentivize citizens really to change their mobility habits. And one of the key tools for this, of course, is through the introduction of effective mobility management initiatives. For this theme, discussions really focused on how the role of mobility management worked in the framework of a sustainable transport, and how really to incentivize it further in the future. In particular, it is important to note that we, of course, work in the framework of specifically priority goal number 3 of the PEP, which identifies the need to, as it says on screen, to manage sustainable mobility and promote a more efficient transport system. But it's also true that many parts of the ECE region still do not have mobility management solutions in place. Thankfully, of course, there are a number of positive examples that we have seen. These are identified in the PEP study on this subject, which there is an image of it here on screen, Mobility Management, a Guide of International Good Practices, But of course, we're also getting continual new examples through the EPOM initiative, which is also chaired by our chair, Mr. Robert Thaler, and also everyday news events. I heard yesterday on the news that in Italy there is a new plan to have mobility managers as a requirement for all companies over 100 employees. And maybe the minister who is planning to provide us with a video statement for next week at the high-level meeting will actually hint at something to do with that. I look forward to hearing that next week. Of course, the group agreed that this theme was particularly important as it ensures, let's say, a holistic approach to encouraging green and healthy, sustainable transport. On the next slide, I'd just like to highlight, I've just highlighted really the key recommendations, and firstly, the importance of preparing a strong national mobility management strategy, and that this really should be developed in coordination, where possible, with other member states under the PEP, to ensure that we have really a harmonized approach on this going forward. These strategies themselves should provide guidance and support aimed at offering sustainable mobility choices and options at a national, at a sub-national, but also at a local level. Importantly, they also need to involve the private sector and cover both passenger and, where possible, freight initiatives. So they should very much seek to focus, as it says on screen, on strengthening the efficient and smart management of mobility needs and transport demand, to ensure inclusive access to mobility and the efficient use of multifunctional infrastructure and transport systems. In implementing these measures, it is important to make public transport and active mobility the preferred option, particularly in cities, including by implementing effective parking policies and other fiscal, regulatory, and physical measures that incentivize really people to switch away from using their private cars and their private vehicles. It's important to make the best possible use of the potential of new transport technologies and also zero-emission vehicles. We will hear a bit more about technologies in the next recommendation. But by combining them together with, obviously, climate-friendly mobility services and logistics. Very much so to ensure the quality and safety of all these public transport services. Embedding digitalization and mobility smartly and cost effectively as services and incorporated into these technology elements, the automated vehicles, etc., are very important for a complete mobility system. This needs to be also looked at in the framework of ensuring transparent data sharing practices and the incorporation of users' perspective and the adaptation of all these aspects in relation to really the post-pandemic situation. There needs to be a strong emphasis on identifying targeted incentives and developing support programs aimed at multimodal, clean, safe, and inclusive mobility management. This needs to be coupled, of course, with appropriate planning for cities, for regions, at company level, but also for tourism, major events, schools, and youth initiatives. All these really need to come together to make sure that it's really the user that remains at the center of any potential solution. Fundamental to this, of course, is ensuring that there is strong awareness raising and the supporting of the awareness raising in the community. Which, of course, this needs to be focused on sustainable mobility planning and land use policies to counteract really this urban sprawl and to provide incentives for modal shift and environment, as well as climate-friendly connectivity and accessibility in the regions. So on the next slide, please. Building on the national strategies and facilitating really the development of sustainable regional and urban plans for mobility management and mobility planning is really fundamental to this. So it's important to include the introduction of sustainable urban mobility plans as part of these initiatives, or similar planning tools that may be requirements in other parts of the ECE region. This also needs to be coupled with an exchange of good practice in the various areas. And where possible, tying back to one of the things I said at the start, identification of common frameworks, but based on the individual experiences and the individual requirements of local authorities, which of course will need to customize where necessary these things. It is important that the promotion and the development of urban logistics hubs is also a key element of this. These need to be, where possible, outside of city centers, in combination of with the implementation of CO2 neutral, let's say, delivery and city logistics options, such as many of the bike freight initiatives that we've seen developing in some of the cities in Germany, for example. So that's a brief overview of what we discussed in recommendation 4. Of course, as with all the other recommendations, there is more detailed information within the document that I showed you earlier, and I hope you'll be able to look into those in more detail, specifically the examples that are in there of good practices really in mobility management. So if possible now, I'd like to pass the floor to Mr. David Howard, Professor in Sustainable Urban Development at the University of Oxford, who coordinated Recommendation 5 to take us through innovating to make transport green and healthy. Thank you very much, David, for your time today, and over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Francesco. So the recommendation 5 was based around presentations and discussions with a group over the last year, and also a scope and review of published peer-reviewed research papers since 2010. So the innovation discussed wasn't just about innovation for innovation's sake. Just because one can doesn't mean one should, and neither is there a notion that the innovation is always the technological fix. Innovation really is also can come in many forms, and Francesco mentioned at the start the importance of behavioural change. So innovations that promote sustainable, positive behavioural change are also a core component of how transport can become green and healthier, or the use of various modes of transport become part of the green and just recovery. So technology is not really about just the object and materials of the process. It's about the use of these forms of innovation. And also aspect of while we look to the future, it's also learning from the past. And so obviously sometimes the notion of revisiting things that worked in the past, such as maybe shared use of public spaces and byways, is one aspect to consider. If I could have the slide, please, Francesca. Great, thank you very much indeed. So of the recommendations that come through the group discussions and the scoping review, we first thought the first one was to expand the integrated mobility as service platforms. So these platforms provide real-time arrivals, service alerts, promote the integration of mobile fare payments. They allow more efficiency in terms of resources and time management for travellers, but also for those providing the transport services. And they unify various modes of transport to provide a more efficient and environmentally, but also time-wise efficient system. The second recommendation was to encourage a switch to zero-emission vehicles. So clearly technology plays a lead in this, but it's not only just the technology itself. Clearly, it's providing innovative policy proposals to try and promote the use of zero-emission vehicles. So the UK government has promoted the zero emissions at the tailpipe for all vans and cars by 2035, but policy alone really doesn't provide that adoption of zero emission vehicles. And so it's providing infrastructure such as charging points, etc., and to look at the whole aspect of the zero emission vehicle, from really the production to the use and clearly the energy source. And I think one of the key aspects is fair access to that infrastructure for charging. So providing those access points for rural and urban areas, areas of low and high income neighborhoods, etc. So affordability of these zero emission vehicles are key. And I think overall the recommendations in some really towards more innovative forms of transport change or transition is to prioritize active travel and provide more integrated mass transit. So zero emission vehicles, although we're commonly focusing on sort of individual or household cars, etc., it should be linked with, as Chris mentioned earlier on, the importance of public transport and integrated mass transport, but also not to delink it from the focus on promoting active travel, such as walkability and wheelability. The third recommendation was to ensure that technology is focused on traffic monitoring, management solutions and enforcement requirements. So technology again is not just on the vehicles per se, but it's using innovative ways to provide more efficient transport systems through, I mentioned the idea of monitoring, managing, and also in some ways enforcing, if you will, fair payment of fares, etc., to try and provide not only a more environmentally but an economically efficient system. Of course, the use of monitoring also must bear in mind the respect of privacy and of transport users throughout at all cases, all moments. And also, I mean, this comes in the role of AI is also considered, and artificial intelligence not only can provide more reliable monitoring and rapid processing, but it can move towards providing a more predictive, self-operative and interoperative mode of transport, integrated transport systems. The other recommendation, fourth recommendation, is to consider the use of alternative technology solution systems to provide transparency in transport management, planning, delivery. So, for example, the use of blockchain theory can promote the pursuit of more sustainable supply chains. So not only consumers, producers can have access to a clear ledger, an accountable ledger of the sources of the transport in terms of the components, the outputs, and the overall impact, the social, economic, and environmental impact on various forms of transport. And the fifth recommendation was the implementation of flexible, responsive, and fair revenue management systems. And this, again, underlies many of the recommendations. And that is really to promote equal access to transport transition, again, to make sure that all members of society can access the technology or can take advantage of innovative forms of transport, and also to really, in some ways, it's that behavioural shift, that change overall. And so having fair access and integrating urban design into innovative urban design into planning for transport is also key. So making that link between urban design, active travel such as walkability, wheelability, very much forefronted in the idea of the 15-minute city. So that's a brief overview of the 5 recommendations on innovation, and the emphasis really is that innovation has to be appropriate and relevant and really attuned to creating a fair access to the various modes of a uniform and integrated transport system.
Thank you very much for that, David. I think you're absolutely right. Your last sentence really summarizes it all. There needs to be an appropriate compromise and an appropriate assessment of those variables to get to a situation where we can have really a solid and appropriate use of technology going forward. And in fact, you know, as you said, the task force really agreed that these technological aspects were a very key element to the future recommendations and all the recommendations as a whole, and really do need to underpin the post-pandemic recovery and of course building forward better. So thank you very much for providing us with that overview. I would now like to move on to pass the floor to Ms. Nino Sharashidze, Technical Officer at WHO Europe, and of course, and most importantly, part of the PEP Secretariat, who coordinated the recommendation number 6 to take us through encouraging active mobility. Thank you very much, Nino. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francesco, for introducing me. So my name is Nino and I'm working for the WHO. And as Francesco said, the most important, I'm part of the PEP Secretariat, and together we are trying to make our transport in the region more healthier, greener, and more sustainable. So as we are really short on time, I think I will go directly to the recommendations. I only have few slides because I did not want Francesco to make your work too hard. So yeah, okay, I like the previous slide also, but it's okay. We all, it was already mentioned how important active mobility is, but we are responsible to develop very concrete and specific recommendations, what should be done to achieve this. But very, very briefly, I will mention that regular walking and cycling and active mobility in general as means of transportations are the healthiest and the most affordable travel modes, and they have lots of health and environmental benefits. And that's why we were very happy when it was decided that we would be responsible for this particular chapter, because this is very much in line with the mandate of the WHO. Because the mandate of the WHO is to build a better and healthier future for people all over the world. But we were not alone in this process. Our Austrian active mobility experts were with us, and we developed these recommendations together. Yes, I like this slide because it shows what are the objectives of the PEP and how we are trying to make the shift, or what we want to do and how we are going to do. I will show, or I will speak in the next slides. So thank you, Francesco. So the measures for promoting active mobility can be categorized in these groups, we think. First of all, responsibilities. It's very important. Supporting and promoting active mobility requires very clear responsibilities at the national and at the local level of the governance. So the responsible authorities should have a specific mandate. They should know that they are responsible for this, and they should have relevant personnel with strong technical competencies to work on these issues, to work on the active mobility issues. Also, it's important that they are, it requires interagency cooperation between responsible sectors, between transport, health, environment, infrastructure, education, even interior and finance ministries. So this cannot be done by one unit, one agency only. So the infrastructure, which is the key, of course, safe, dense, well-connected, well-designed, and comfortable infrastructure for active mobility are important determinants for choosing this transport mode. The distribution of the public space today for active modes are not really fair, and it was very obvious during the pandemic crisis when the increasing number of cyclists and pedestrians found insufficient space to walk and cycle. But at the same time, it was really interesting experience during the pandemic that this extreme nature of the measures that was introduced to fight the pandemic somehow forced the governments, even the people, to think differently about the mobility patterns. And many of the largest and the most dynamic cities in the world and in Europe have reacted to the COVID-19 crisis, and they massively started expanding streets for pedestrians and for cyclists. It was in Milan, in Paris, Berlin, London, and also outside in Europe. So it was a very, very good example how agile governments can be when they really need, and when there is a need. It was also obvious that, and the pandemic crisis showed that urban areas could consider the further redistribution of road spaces in favor of walking and cycling. And narrowing the motorized roads can also help traffic calming, as wider lanes unintentionally make drivers speed up and make roads more dangerous, and especially for non-motorized transport users. So in planning and designing transport infrastructure in cities, one of the challenges is taking active mobility and in particular cyclists seriously. And this is the problem, especially outside of the European Union. Cyclists are not really taken seriously as specific road users. So the main principle should be that pedestrians and cyclists are considered as equal road users on the street, and public space should be divided equitably for all. So the next category is regulatory issues. Road traffic and the traffic safety in general have serious influence on active mobility. They are particularly important as pedestrians and cyclists are the most vulnerable road users, as we know. And there is a need to improve the legislation and to make sure that these vulnerable road users are better protected. And we think that one of the most important safety aspects is speed limits. And many cities, again, during the pandemic, many cities reduced speed limits to 30 kilometers per hour or even less. And this was the safest, this is the safest limit for mixed use roads. So lower vehicle speeds provide safer conditions. And again, this is especially important for those who are not regular cyclists. And during the pandemic, even those people started cycling who normally did not do that. The next category is economic and fiscal measures. And we know that monetary instruments for incentives or for discouraging specific behaviors are very important. For example, some cities and companies were implementing parking management schemes, or they were subsidizing emissions vehicles and bike sharing systems, zero emissions vehicles and bike sharing systems. And some cities during the pandemic, they even made bike sharing systems free for use by health sector professionals and other essential workers. So more economic incentives are possible. And that we should think about those that would indirectly encourage active mobility and directly discourage car use, for example, by pricing parking or congestion charging schemes and some others. Funding is, of course, the key, and in order to achieve a modal shift towards active mobility, it is crucial to provide adequate investments. Maybe everybody, all countries, all cities are providing some, but it should be adequate. And providing sufficient budget for cycling and walking infrastructure, we think that will guarantee a high rate of return of these investments. Regular cycling and walking, again, have so many, it really has multiple health, social, and economic benefits, and investments in policy actions on walking, cycling, active recreation can really contribute to the progress, to the development, and even achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And the rest, the last but not least, for sure, it's education and communication. Attitudes, habits, and social and personal norms can influence the intention to use certain transport modes. And that's why education, awareness raising, mass media, and community-wide campaigns related to the benefits of safe walking and cycling can really play a significant role in encouraging people to shift to the active mobility modes. And we also thought that the role of celebrities and well-known influential people can also be used in this process for promoting cycling. It always works very well. And also the parents have a special responsibility to shape their children's travel behavior from the very beginning, and also to show a good example. So the more parents travel by bicycle, the higher possibilities that their children will do the same. And at the end, I would like to say that active mobility, we think that active mobility solutions cannot be considered in isolation. Implementation of these measures needs to be done in an integrated way, and also need to be supported by strong policy and regulatory framework. And that's why so if you go to the next slide, the ministers of transport, health and environment decided to initiate this master plan for cycling promotion, and we have very ambitious objectives, and it is one of the strong recommendations of our recommendation to implement this plan. So thank you very much. This was briefly about our chapter, and I think that even just this implementation of this master plan with very specific 33 recommendations can very much support promotion of cycling, and in general increasing the safety and sustainability of transport and mobility in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nino, for those inspiring words on active mobility, which is really the driving force behind much of the discussions over the side events that we've had these 3 days, and also that continue this afternoon. But importantly, also it's a key element of the high-level meeting of next week. So I was going to say last but not least, but I still have my fingers crossed that we'll be able to sort out the technological issues for Brian, and he can come back and join us in the last few minutes of the event. But in any case, for the moment, I'd like to pass the floor to our final inverted commas recommendation, and of course to our in-house duo of Virginia Fusé, Environmental Affairs Officer, and Amy Choi, Consultant, both within the Environment Division here at UNECE. They will present recommendation 7 on leaving no one behind. And Virginia, I think you're up first, so over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Virginia. The importance of this recommendation and the issues highlighted cannot be understated. The consequences of COVID-19 on transport have been widely recognized, and many people's mobility choices have been affected by COVID-19. But it has been really less documented how the pandemic has had an exacerbating effect on social disparities related to transport. For example, people who were and are still unable to work from home during the pandemic have been more exposed to the virus during their working hours. Generally, as Virginia said, these individuals are migrants and racial or ethnic minorities and women who are disproportionately represented in essential work settings, such as healthcare facilities, factories, client-facing roles, and public transportation. In many situations, this risk may be further exacerbated for those with less secure or unsafe labor conditions. And I also want to emphasize that the effects of COVID-19 have simply heightened the existing problems of poor transport systems. Poor transport systems could look like public transport not providing sufficient access to destinations, or having limited availability in certain areas, such as rural villages, or being unsafe for use. There could also be high levels of air and noise pollution in some urban areas as a result of road congestion, or there may be a greater risk of injury on road networks. All of these issues perpetuate unfair and non-inclusive transport systems and stops people from being able to participate fully in society. As such, in rebuilding and transforming transport systems, measures could be sustainable, but they might not be fair if they fail to recognize the needs of vulnerable and disadvantaged groups. And though transport and mobility aren't a cause of social disparities, the lack of mobility options can exacerbate problems. So our broader recommendation is to leave no one behind, specifically by collecting data to assess the level of transport inequalities and reduce transport poverty, by planning transport networks to avoid creating disadvantaged neighborhoods and transport isolated areas, planning new developments by keeping in mind accessibility in public transport, and especially by ensuring that various actors, especially grassroots and community initiatives, are involved. It is also recommended to focus future transport investments in multifunctional infrastructure for sustainable development, paying particular attention to developments in deprived areas and areas with low levels of transit accessibility. Finally, there should also be a focus on implementing urban planning initiatives aimed at improving the quality of life of people in all aspects by providing efficient access to essential services and goods. To conclude, we should not ignore how the benefits and drawbacks of transport are not distributed equally. And moving forward, we hope that member states take on board these recommendations to move towards sustainable, healthy, but ultimately fair and non-discriminatory transport systems for everyone. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Virginia and Amy. I see in the chat that many of you didn't actually hear Virginia. I apologize for that. If she needs to re-intervene again, we are socially distanced in the UNECE control room, so maybe I will have her come around and sit at my desk if she needs to intervene again. I am very pleased to see Brian has managed to join us. Thank you very much, Brian. Congratulations, and thank you very much to our technical support colleagues for helping him join the situation. You've missed most of the discussion, but I hope you'll be able to give us a rundown of recommendation 1 and the work that was done for that very important recommendation. Thank you very much, and over to you.
All right, Francesco, thank you so much. Are you able to hear me okay?
Thank you, perfectly.
Wonderful.
And see you as well.
Thank you very much indeed, Francesco. Good morning.
My sincere apologies.
I've been having a gremlins morning with the UN. I was speaking at another CE event this morning, and there was some issue there as well. But anyway, I am delighted to be here, and I will not use up any more worrying about the technology. thank you to be a member of the PEP.
The gremlins are back, I think. We've lost Brian again. I think it's not our lucky day with Brian. We'll see if we can get him back online. I don't know if he's still connected. But I note that also we are running very much over time, and I hope our technical colleagues will allow us to keep going for a brief moment. Maybe while Brian reconnects, Amy, could you put us on slide 36, please, just so that we can say a few more words, and hopefully he'll be able to reconnect then. Just to give a quick rundown, I guess, of the concluding aspects of the publication. We have developed in it some final steps, some next steps really, revolving around the implementation of the recommendations, and of course as a key component of the high-level meeting and the Vienna Declaration next week. So the main elements really I would like to raise in terms of this concluding documents is really how we're going to implement it and how this will work going forward in relation to the call for action that we have, that I mentioned at the start of the seminar this morning. The majority of the work will really be guided, let's say, through the creation of a dedicated partnership. The partnership theme and content is really something that's the basis of many of the work in the PEP. We hope that it will be supported by a strong role for the PEP relay races. For those of you who don't know what these are, they're dedicated workshops within member states discussing specific aspects. There will, of course, need to be further focus on the PEP clearinghouse in order to consider how to facilitate its wider use. And that's something also that I've heard discussed in previous side events, the importance of this. This should, of course, be supported by increased collaboration with universities and scientific organizations through developing specific partnerships where possible and where it's already been established through the work of the task force. Finally, of course, there is a strong element of developing additional really capacity building actions focused on providing guidance to member states on building forward better, which is really our key theme. All this, we hope, will be accompanied by the developments of a mechanism for the ongoing monitoring and implementation of the recommendations themselves. So that was really the summary and of the recommendations themselves and of the last chapter. Brian's back. Excellent. We can see you again. Go ahead, keep going back to recommendation 1. You're on mute. You'll need to unmute.
All right.
We're going to feedback. Go ahead.
Don't understand.
We're still getting lots of feedback from Brian. Try again, Brian.
Yeah.
No, it's going to work. If you don't mind, Brian, I'll just read out quickly the recommendations as they were for recommendation 1. And I apologize on this, but so at least we the rundown of the main recommendations before we close the session today. So again, going back to recommendation 1, really this was very much about implementing sustainable urban and transport planning solutions. And this was really something of a framework, let's say, recommendation, which was to really underpin many of the other ones that we've discussed today. So we're seeking to introduce modern principles and tools for spatial and urban planning in urban, suburban, and rural environments. Very much through focused on accessibility for people, for goods, for services, and to, of course, the main points of interest, minimizing where possible the generation of demand for transport and optimizing investment in infrastructure and services through, and here are the key focus areas, let's say, ensuring an optimal density in urban development and promoting mixed-use urban areas and buildings combined with appropriate green and healthy transport capacity by integrating spatial and transport planning, implementing urban planning initiatives to improve people's quality of life by providing safe access to goods and services, and to what we discussed at great length, green and blue areas within the 15-minute neighborhood principle, aiming to really apply a principle of a short distance city. Ensuring that spatial and urban planning guidelines and policies primarily focus on accessibility needs of the entire population, including the vulnerable users, in particular children and youth, as well as senior citizens and persons with reduced mobility, as we heard in Amy's intervention earlier in relation to recommendation 7. Ensuring the assessment of the impacts of major construction projects on transport and mobility, as well as on the economy, environment and health. Introducing new urban assessment methodologies that map access to these green, blue and quiet places, as well as data on GDP and public health in order to inform future planning decisions. Orienting urban development towards high capacity, green, safe, healthy and high quality public transport systems. Creating green corridors that combine the advantage of environmental corridors with opportunities for the active mobility that Nino was discussing earlier. Developing and engaging communication programs to involve people, engage users, and generate public support, particularly during the planning phase, to help ensure public buy-in for the solutions proposed. And as we heard, this is obviously a key element to many of the other recommendations. And implementing, of course, the recommendations of the UNECE and the PEP handbook on sustainable urban mobility and spatial planning, in line with the goals of the PEP to integrate transport, health, and environment objectives into urban planning policies. So those were, let's say, that was a quick summary of recommendation 1. As you heard from what I was saying, it's very much linked as a link, let's say, to the other recommendations, and provide that overview and that initial step, let's say, to go into then the more details of the recommendations. So unfortunately, we've run out of time for today. Thank you very much. But before we close, I'd like to take the opportunity really to thank all the speakers and those that have intervened today. I would also like to thank all the members of the task force that work so tirelessly to complete these recommendations as set out in these important documents. It's really thanks to you and your hard work and efforts that over such a short period of time we've been able to produce a document that has really been widely recognized for its importance and its and of course, as a result, its main recommendations are an annex to the Vienna Declaration, to be adopted at the high-level meeting next week. On screen, there's a link to the recommendations, which can be also easily reached through the publications section on our website. Do download it, do go through it in detail. Hopefully, we'll be able to see each other in person again soon, at which point I'll be happy to give you one of these printed copies or to hand these out. We now, because the UN is very environmentally friendly and we don't like wasting paper. That's a joke which doesn't really work on screen, I apologize. Finally, of course, I'd like to encourage you to attend the session on the 17th and the 18th next week, the main high-level meeting session, and listen to the multitude of ministers who are scheduled to intervene, really in helping to pave the way for building forward better. You will, of course, be able to access the session from the stage button on the main conference platform, and it will be available in English, French, Russian, and German. After this session, do take a moment to check out the remaining side events of today on other key aspects related to the PEP. So that's really it for me today. I'd really thank you again for participating. I look forward to connecting with you all very soon. A special thank you to my colleagues sitting here in the crisis room now. We should really call it the crisis room at UNECE, Virginia and Amy, for helping out in the organization and the running of the event today. So thank you all. Have a nice day, and I look forward to seeing you all very soon.